The smell reached you before anything else. Fresh bread baking at 4 in the morning, coffee brewing somewhere below, and beneath it all, salt air. Pure Atlantic salt air at 650 feet, rushing through windows you could actually open while travelling 76 miles per hour. Stand at those promenade windows, and you'd see individual faces waving from shore, cottage gardens, sailboats, and then that strange drowsiness would overtake you. "It is like this on every trip," the chief steward would say. "The ocean air up here, you see." For 13 months, in 1936 and 1937, fewer than 4,000 people experienced this, crossing an ocean by air aboard the Hindenburg. Let's step aboard and discover what it was actually like. Picture Frankfurt in early May 1936. The city's still finding its feet after years of hardship, but there's energy in the air, a sense that the future might finally be arriving. And on this particular afternoon, that future is sitting in a hangar at the Rhine-Main airfield, waiting. The Hotel Frankfurter Hof fills with passengers and well-wishers as the day wears on. There's a peculiar atmosphere, part celebration, part nervous anticipation. The friends are more exuberant. The passengers themselves wear an outward calm, but you can see it in their eyes. They're about to do something extraordinary. They're about to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. Not in an airplane. Those don't exist yet, not for passengers crossing oceans. No, they're going to fly in the largest object that has ever taken to the sky. They're going to spend 2.5 days floating 650 feet above the Atlantic, eating 5-course meals on gold-rimmed china, sleeping in tiny cabins within the belly of a ship filled with 7 million cubic feet of hydrogen. They're going to fly aboard the Hindenburg. Let's step back to that May afternoon and walk with them towards something the world had never seen before and would never see again. The buses leave the hotel in late afternoon, carrying passengers and their precisely weighed luggage toward the airfield. And then, as the hangar doors roll open, there it is. 803 feet of silver fabric stretched over a skeleton of aluminum girders. It doesn't quite seem real. Something that large shouldn't be able to exist, much less fly. It's longer than the Titanic, longer than 3 Boeing 747s placed end to end, and yet it's going to lift off the ground and carry you across an ocean. The Hindenburg sits at its mooring mast like a patient whale. Its nose is tethered, its tail fin, bearing that enormous swastika the Nazi government insisted upon, shifting slightly in the breeze. The maximum diameter is 135 feet. Stand beneath it, and you feel dwarfed, insignificant, wonderstruck. Webb Miller, the United Press correspondent aboard the maiden voyage, tried to capture that first sight. "The huge bulk," he wrote, and you can hear the awe in those words. Because huge doesn't quite cover it. Neither does enormous or colossal. The German language has a better word, Luftschiff, airship. But even that feels inadequate for something this improbable. The boarding stairs are wheeled into place. Ground crew members in white coveralls move with practiced efficiency. And as you climb those stairs, heart pounding, trying to appear calmer than you feel, you pass through a door in the ship's hull and step into another world entirely. The first thing that surprises you is how ordinary it feels. Not the gilt palace you might have imagined. The corridors are narrow. The walls are covered in fabric. Light blue, grey, beige, depending on where you are. Pulled taut over foam. Touch them and they give slightly under your fingers. You're on A deck, the upper of 2 passenger levels, tucked into a compact section, about 1/3 of the way back from the nose. The entire passenger area occupies only a fraction of the ship's enormous length. Most of that 803 feet is given over to hydrogen cells, engines, fuel tanks, and the vast interior framework that holds everything together. A steward guides you to your cabin. The number is painted on the door. You step inside and, well, it's small, very small. 6.5 feet by 5.5 feet, 35 square feet. barely larger than a modern elevator. There are no windows. The cabin is entirely interior, an aluminum-framed upper and lower berth. The upper folds against the wall during the day. A small wash basin with hot and cold running water. A fold-down table. A stool. A curtained wardrobe niche. That's it. That's what $400 buys you. Roughly $7,000 in today's money. The same price as a new automobile. The walls are thin. You can hear passengers moving about in neighbouring cabins. Hear conversations conducted in German, English, fragments of French. But the fabric covering provides some dampening, and honestly, you won't be spending much time in here. The cabin is for sleeping, for washing up, for storing your limited luggage. £50 per passenger, strictly weighed. Every ounce matters when you're trying to lift 242 tons into the air. Life aboard happens elsewhere. In the public spaces, in the dining room and the promenades and the smoking room that shouldn't by all rights exist. Let's walk through them. The dining room occupies the entire port side of A deck. 47 feet long, 13 feet wide, with windows that slant outward to flood the space with natural light. The walls are covered in silk wallpaper, painted with murals, images of the Graf Zeppelin soaring over South America's green coastlines. The work of Professor Otto Arpke, brought in to make this aluminum ship feel warm, human, alive. Tables are dressed in crisp white linen. Fresh-cut flowers sit in vases, flowers changed daily, impossibly, in the middle of the Atlantic. The chairs are aluminum frames with red upholstery, light enough that you can lift one with a crooked finger. Everything aboard has been designed within an inch of its life to save weight. Everything except the china. The plates are porcelain from Heinrich and Company in Bavaria. Ivory body, decorated with 24-carat gold bands. A cobalt blue rim stripe. The DZR logo, a dirigible circling a blue globe. Despite the fanatical weight saving elsewhere, despite walls made of fabric and furniture made of aluminum, these plates are deliberately, defiantly heavy. Real gold. Real weight. A statement: you may be flying through the air in what amounts to a fabric balloon, but you will dine as though you're in the finest restaurant in Europe. The lounge and writing room occupy the starboard side. More of Arpke's murals, these ones showing the routes of Magellan, Cook, Vasco da Gama, Columbus, alongside the tracks of the great German ocean liners Bremen and Europa, linking this new form of travel to the grand tradition of exploration and adventure. During the 1936 season, the lounge held something remarkable: a baby grand piano. Not just any piano, a specially designed Bluthner with a frame and legs made of aluminum, covered in pale yellow pigskin, weighing just 356 pounds instead of the usual 500 plus. It used thinner strings at reduced tension, and yet reporters praised its surprisingly full tone. Professor Franz Wagner gave recitals. On the maiden voyage, as the Hindenburg approached America, NBC's Max Jordan set up a live radio broadcast, pioneering in-flight broadcasting. And Wagner played Schubert's Serenade and Strauss's Blue Danube, while Lady Suzanne Wilkins sang I'm in the Mood for Love. Imagine that, sitting in a floating lounge 650 feet above the Atlantic, listening to live piano music being broadcast to millions of listeners who could scarcely believe what they were hearing. The piano was removed before the 1937 season. Weight savings. 9 additional cabins were being added to B deck below, and something had to give. But perhaps the most beloved spaces aboard were the promenade decks. Port and starboard, running along the outer edges of A deck, lined with long observation windows that slanted outward. These windows could be opened in flight. Think about that for a moment. You're 650 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, travelling at 76 miles per hour, and you can open the window. The salt air rushes in, fresh and cold and impossibly clean. Chief Steward Heinrich Kubis kept those windows open whenever weather permitted, and the effect on passengers was remarkable. They became drowsy, almost narcotically so. "It is like this on every trip," Kubisz explained to one journalist. "I keep the windows open, but everybody goes to sleep. The ocean air, it is good enough on steamers, but up here, you see? Stand at those windows, leaning out slightly, wind in your face, and you could look down on individual sailboats, cottage gardens, the faces of people waving from shore. At this altitude, the world was close enough to see details, but distant enough to feel like you were suspended between earth and sky, belonging to neither." Webb Miller described dawn over England. The rising sun silhouetted the South Downs like a relief map. Approaching New York, a necklace-like string of lights, miles long the coast of Long Island. The Hindenburg regularly flew directly over Manhattan. Captain Pruss would chart courses past the Empire State Building, while steamships far below bellowed their whistles and trained searchlights upward. Imagine looking down on the spire of the Chrysler Building. Imagine having that view, that perspective in 1936. And then there was the smoking room. On B deck, below the dining room, accessible through a double-door airlock, was perhaps the most audacious piece of engineering in aviation history. A pressurized room where passengers could light cigars and cigarettes inside a vessel containing 7 million cubic feet of hydrogen. Let that sink in. Hydrogen, the most flammable gas known to man, and someone designed a room where people could smoke. The room was kept at positive air pressure relative to its surroundings. If hydrogen leaked, air would flow outward, not inward. Entry required passing through a revolving door system, monitored constantly by the bartender, who ensured no one left with a lit cigarette, cigar, or pipe. The sole ignition source was a single electric lighter, a glowing coil similar to an automobile cigarette lighter, tethered by a cord. All personal lighters and matches were confiscated at boarding by Chief Steward Kubisz, who would inform passengers with characteristic German directness. "We Germans don't fool around with hydrogen." The interior was painted blue, with dark blue-grey leather seating. The walls were covered in yellow pigskin, the same material used on the piano. Apke had painted illustrations depicting the history of lighter-than-air flight, from the Montgolfier brothers' first balloon through the Graf Zeppelin. Sealed windows along one side offered vertiginous views straight down to the ocean. And presiding over this impossible space was bartender Max Schulze, formerly of the Hamburg America line, who served the ship's signature cocktails, the LZ 129 frosted cocktail, gin and orange juice over crushed ice, and the Maybach 12, a cocktail whose recipe died with Schulze at Lakehurst. Here's a detail that captures something essential about the Hindenburg. Schulze was well liked, but remarkably unfamiliar with basic American cocktails. A company memo expressed astonishment that the bartender on a ship so frequently carrying Americans had never heard of a Manhattan. On the maiden voyage, when the bar ran out of gin, passenger Pauline Charteris improvised a Kirsch-based cocktail that fueled a party lasting most of the night. The smoking room was arguably the most popular space aboard, both because smoking was nearly universal in the 1930s and because it doubled as the bar, and the bar was where passengers gathered after dinner, where friendships formed, where the journey transformed from travel into experience. So what was it actually like to spend days aboard this floating palace? Let's walk through a typical crossing. You wake in absolute darkness. Your cabin has no windows, and when the electric lights are off, the darkness is total, a cocooning blackness inside the belly of an 800-foot airship. You lie there for a moment, feeling the gentle, almost imperceptible motion, hearing the distant hum of diesel engines that never stops, never changes pitch, never intrudes. The takeoff yesterday, was it yesterday? Time becomes strange out here, was so gentle you didn't realize you'd left the ground. No roar of engines, no thrust pushing you back in your seat. just a slight lifting sensation, and then you were looking down at the crowd gathered at Rhine-Main, watching them grow smaller, watching Frankfurt unfold beneath you like a map drawn in 3 dimensions. You get up, wash at the little basin, dress. Step out into the corridor where someone has already been by with coffee. The smell reaches you before you see the steward, fresh coffee and something else. Bread, baking bread. The galley has been working since 4 a.m. The dining room is already half full when you arrive. Sunlight streams through those slanted windows, and you can see clouds below you, vast white landscapes that stretch to the horizon. The ship's shadow moves across them, surrounded by rainbow halos. Breakfast is continental. Coffee served in silver pots that hold exactly 3 cups. Because by the time you finish 3 cups, your steward has returned with a fresh pot. Fresh bread, baked that morning aboard. Eggs prepared to nationality, soft-boiled for Germans, scrambled for Americans. Frankfurt, sausage, ham, cheese, fruit. The tables are set as carefully as for dinner, those gold-rimmed plates, the crisp linens, the flowers that somehow stay fresh. You're wearing the same linen napkin throughout the voyage, stored between meals in a personalised envelope. Even that small detail matters when you're trying to keep 242 tons airborne. And the food tastes vivid. That's the word passengers kept using, vivid. Every flavour seems sharper, more distinct than it should. It's because you're flying at only 650 feet, unpressurized with windows open. Your taste buds aren't dulled the way they would be at 35,000 feet in a modern jet. The salt air, the altitude, the freshness of everything, it all combines to make even simple breakfast extraordinary. After breakfast, you drift to the promenades. Other passengers are already there, leaning against the windows, watching. Always watching. What is there to watch? Everything. Nothing. The ocean scrolling past below. Cloud formations, the ship's shadow. Occasionally another ship, a steamer making its way to Europe or America, and you can see the passengers on deck pointing up at you, waving. The Hindenburg often dipped low in greeting, and ships' whistles would sound in salute. Time moves strangely. You're chasing the sun westward, and days stretch to 27 hours. Passengers struggle to reconcile Greenwich time, Central European time, ship's time, Eastern Standard Time. Eventually, most give up and simply surrender to the rhythm of meals and sleep, and the endless, hypnotic watching. Some passengers read. The writing room offers stationery, and people send postcards with special Hindenburg postmarks. Mail was a significant revenue source. Hans Hinrichs, a grain dealer on the maiden voyage, wrote hundreds of postcards using a rubber stamp reading "Greetings from mid-ocean and mid-air." The ride quality is legendary. You can balance a pencil on its end atop a table and it won't fall. The ship maintains perfect level flight. There's a dedicated elevatorman continuously adjusting pitch, primarily in the interest of passenger comfort. No rolling, no pitching. The Collier's magazine correspondent captured it perfectly. Like an ocean voyage with the rolling and pitching left out and the time cut in half. If Professor Wagner is aboard and the piano hasn't yet been removed, there might be music. Passengers gather in the lounge, listening, feeling impossibly sophisticated and impossibly far from everything they know. Around 1 o'clock, you return to the dining room for lunch. The meal is substantial. This is a German ship after all, and Germans take their midday meals seriously. A typical menu might offer broth Theodore, Bavarian-style fattened duckling with champagne cabbage, potatoes with Madeira wine gravy, convent-style pears, mocha. The food is emphatically, unapologetically German, rich, meat-heavy, drenched in butter and cream sauces. American passengers sometimes balked. Complaints grew common enough that the company considered printing mourning cards reading, "We would be happy to prepare an omelette for you if there's nothing on the menu that appeals to you." But even passengers who found the cuisine too heavy couldn't deny the quality. The wine cellar carried over 250 bottles of fine German Rieslings and Moselles, 2 champagnes, 5 liqueurs, plus American whiskey, and hundreds of bottles of German beer. On special occasions, like the famous Millionaire's Flight of October 1936, the wines could be spectacular. 1934, Pais Porter Gold Tröpfchen, 1928, Feist Brut. Watching other passengers at lunch, you're struck by the mix. Cotton brokers, pharmaceutical executives, perfume importers, advertising men, journalists, military observers, the occasional celebrity. Douglas Fairbanks, Sr., flew with his wife in August 1936. Max Schmeling returned to Germany triumphant after defeating Joe Louis. Nelson Rockefeller was among 72 passengers on that legendary Millionaire's Flight, whose combined net worth reportedly exceeded $1 billion. But everyone paid the same fare and received identical service. There were no class distinctions aboard the Hindenburg. The cotton broker and the movie star ate the same meals, slept in identical cabins, shared the same public spaces. Afternoons drift by, more time at the windows, card games in the lounge, letters written, conversations struck up with fellow passengers, friendships forming in that peculiar way they do when people are removed from their ordinary lives and suspended together in an extraordinary situation. New York Herald Tribune correspondent Mary Day Wynn described the sound, a low, steady murmur, barely entering consciousness. That's the 4 diesel engines, housed in separate external gondolas, producing a constant but distant hum. It's audible, but never intrusive. The passenger areas are insulated by the hull structure and those fabric-covered foam walls. As evening approaches, passengers begin drifting back to their cabins to change for dinner. This is the most formal meal of the day, and while not evening dress exactly, people make an effort. Dinner might include Hamilton cream soup, grilled sole, venison cutlets, Bernie potatoes, mushrooms in cream sauce, mixed cheese plate. Other documented dishes included Rhine salmon à la Graf Zeppelin, halibut with mousseline sauce, veal steak with truffle sauce, strawberry cream with whipped cream. The dining room in evening light is something special. The sun setting over the Atlantic, light pouring through those slanted windows, the murmur of conversation in multiple languages, the soft clink of real silver on real porcelain. After dinner, passengers migrate to the smoking room. Now the real socializing begins. Cocktails mixed by Max, who's still trying to master American tastes. Cuban cigars purchased aboard. The blue leather chairs filling up. Conversations growing louder and more animated as the evening wears on. On the maiden voyage, the party continued most of the night, fueled by improvised cocktails and multilingual toasts. As the ship approached the American coast before dawn, passengers crowded the promenade windows in their nightclothes. At 4:12 a.m., we sighted on our right a necklace-like string of lights miles long, Webb Miller wrote. Suddenly, a great pandemonium of hundreds of whistles from steamers and liners rose to greet us. The lights in the promenades were turned out to afford a better view. The sleeping millions 1,000 feet below seemed unaware of our passage. Eventually you return to your cabin. Leave your shoes outside the door. They'll be freshly polished by morning. The steward has been by already. Your berth is made up with fresh linens. You lie in absolute darkness again, feeling that gentle, constant motion, hearing that distant hum. Sleep comes easily. That ocean air, that peculiar drowsiness, you sink into it like a warm bath. And somewhere below you, in the all-electric kitchen on B deck, the night crew is already beginning preparations for tomorrow's breakfast. The bread will need to start at 4 a.m., the coffee, the eggs. The ship never sleeps, even when its passengers do. We should talk about the people who created this experience. The crew of 40 regular members who made the magic happen. Start with Heinrich Kubis. He holds a distinction few people know. Guinness certified him as the world's first flight attendant, having begun serving passengers aboard the DeLag Zeppelin LZ, 10 Schwaben in March 1912, 18 years before the first female flight attendant took to the skies. Kubis was trained at the Hotel Ritz in Paris and the Carlton Hotel in London. He was multilingual, exacting, warm, and utterly professional. He managed everything from table service to the confiscation of matches at boarding, to keeping those promenade windows open so passengers would get drowsy and stay out of trouble. By the second morning of a crossing, your steward knew how you took your tea. By the third, he had learned your name, your cabin, your habits. He knew you liked an extra blanket at night. He knew you preferred the Times to the Herald. He anticipated what you needed before you knew you needed it. This wasn't servitude, this was craft. These men took pride in their work, in their ability to create comfort and elegance under extraordinary circumstances. Down in the galley, head chef Xaver Meyer, recruited from the Ritz Hotel in Paris, commanded an all-electric kitchen staffed by 5 assistant cooks and a 14-year-old cabin boy named Werner Franz. Think about what Meyer accomplished. He fed up to 100 people, passengers and crew. Multiple elaborate meals per day, on a moving platform 650 feet above the ocean, using only electric equipment because open flames were absolutely forbidden aboard a hydrogen ship. Provisions for a single Atlantic crossing included approximately 440 pounds of fresh meat and poultry, 800 eggs, 220 pounds of butter, 440 pounds of potatoes, 440 pounds of canned goods, 40 gallons of milk, plus live lobsters, turkeys, gallons of ice cream and crates of fruit. The kitchen was constructed entirely of aluminum. Ovens, stoves, warming plates, refrigerators, an ice machine, all electric. Food reached the A-deck dining room via a dumbwaiter connecting to a serving pantry. Meyer's assistant, Alfred Grosinger, would survive the disaster and eventually open his own restaurants, becoming a founding member of the Friends of the Zeppelin Museum. Meyer himself escaped virtually unharmed, jumping 15 feet from a service hatch, his kitchen whites unscorched. But that May Day in 1937 was still a year away. In 1936, Meyer was at the height of his powers, creating his careful magic 3 times a day, sending plate after perfect plate up that dumbwaiter to passengers who had no idea of the complexity behind each meal. The officers, Captain Ernst Lehmann, Captain Max Pruss, the watch officers, brought their own grace to the experience. Lehmann was particularly beloved. He played accordion with passengers, gave personal tours, commanded with warmth. One story captures the spirit. In August 1936, Philadelphia lawyer Clarence Hall was aboard. As they passed over Philadelphia, Lehmann invited Hall to the control car and, following Hall's directions, guided the Hindenburg directly over Hall's family home and office building. Can you imagine? Directing an 800-foot airship over your own house, watching your neighbours pour into the street to wave up at you. That kind of personal attention, that gentlemanly hospitality, was typical of Lehmann, typical of the era, and utterly unimaginable in modern travel. Behind the scenes, the crew moved through the ship's vast interior via a keel walkway, a triangular corridor running the length of the hull, past fuel tanks, ballast tanks, cargo holds, and engine access points. Above the passenger decks, the enormous cathedral-like hull stretched upward, filled with 16 gas cells, blue lacquered aluminum framework, and the axial catwalk that ran through the ship's centre. This was their domain, the hidden world that made the visible world possible. But we're only halfway through this story. We've seen how passengers lived and ate and slept, but we haven't yet explored the deeper truths of this experience. What did it cost? Who could afford it? What was it like for the crew working through the night while passengers slumbered in those tiny cabins? And what happened during those final flights as the summer of 1936 gave way to spring 1937. Those stories are waiting. Shall we continue? Let's talk about money. Because while the Hindenburg didn't have class divisions, every passenger ate the same meals, slept in cabins of roughly equal size, shared the same public spaces. The simple truth is that $400 was a fortune in 1936. Think of it this way. A new automobile cost about $400. First-class passage on the finest German ocean liner cost roughly half that. The average American worker earned about $1,300 for an entire year's labour. So a one-way ticket to Europe on the Hindenburg represented nearly a third of an annual salary. In today's terms, that $400 translates to somewhere between $7,000 and $9,000. For a ticket, one way. And that was just the base fare. It didn't include the tips you'd press into stewards' palms at journey's end, the cocktails in the smoking room, the postcards and souvenirs. Who could afford this? Pharmaceutical executives, perfume importers, military observers travelling on government expense accounts, journalists whose newspapers wanted the prestige of having their correspondent file stories from an airship crossing the Atlantic. People with business interests that justified the speed. Remember, the Hindenburg cut crossing time in half compared to the fastest ocean liner. Time was money, and for some, 2.5 days versus 5 made economic sense. And then there were those for whom money simply wasn't an object. The Millionaire's Flight of October 9th, 1936, carried 72 passengers on a 10.5-hour cruise over New England. Nelson Rockefeller was aboard. The combined net worth of passengers reportedly exceeded $1 billion in 1936 money. They sipped champagne, watched autumn foliage scroll past below, and lunched on swallow nest soup, cold rind salmon, tenderloin steak, chateau potatoes, and iced melon, accompanied by that 1934 Peisporter Gold Tröpfchen and 1928 Feist Brut. For them, $400 was pocket change. The experience, that was priceless. The most detailed surviving account comes from Clarence E. Hall, that Philadelphia lawyer returning from the 1936 Berlin Olympics with his wife Dorothy. His diary opens with wonderful precision. An atmosphere of suppressed excitement began to pervade the Hotel Frankfurter Hof as the airship travellers and their friends gathered during the course of the afternoon. The friends were more exuberant, and the passengers disclosed an outward calm, but I doubt if one of them escaped the thrill which we felt at the impending adventure. You can feel it in those words, that mixture of excitement and attempted nonchalance. These were sophisticated people who had travelled, who weren't supposed to be impressed easily. And yet they were about to board an 800-foot airship for a flight across the Atlantic. How could you not feel that thrill? Webb Miller, the United Press correspondent, captured the departure with particular vividness. As the huge bulk drifted upward, silently and slowly, we looked down into the upturned faces of thousands of frantically cheering townsfolk, spotlighted by the downward beams of 2 searchlights in the belly of the ship. The waving forest of arms gradually receded. Signal bells jangled in the engine gondolas, and the 4 motors roared. And then, watching Land's End slip away as they crossed into the Atlantic proper. Its white houses, red cliffs, and fresh green fields glistened in the early morning sun. As the rocky finger of Land's End faded from sight, and we started across 3,000 miles of rolling water, the full realization of the romance and adventure of the flight came home to me. Romance and adventure. Those words appeared again and again in passenger accounts. This wasn't just transportation. It was experience. It was story. It was something you would tell your grandchildren about. Douglas Fairbanks Sr. brought the first animal aboard, a 6-month-old Scotty dog named Bobby Burns, who moved freely about the passenger quarters. Captain Albert Samt asked both Fairbanks and Max Schmeling to sign a picture postcard mid-Atlantic. Professor Jean Labatut of Princeton booked passage on sheer impulse by walking into a travel office. His 16mm film of the flight survives in Princeton's manuscripts division. These weren't just passengers. They were witnesses to something extraordinary, and they knew it. While passengers ate their 5-course dinners and balanced pencils on tabletops, an entire other world operated out of sight. The engine cars, for instance. 4 separate gondolas hung beneath the hull, each housing a Daimler-Benz diesel engine, producing 1,200 horsepower. Engine car mechanics stood only 2 to 3 hour watches because the noise and vibration were mentally taxing. But that punishment remained sealed away from passengers, insulated by hull structure and careful design. The keel walkway ran the length of the ship, a triangular corridor where crew moved through darkness past fuel tanks, ballast tanks, cargo holds. Above, in the vast cathedral of the hull proper, 16 cotton gas cells held their hydrogen in suspension. The aluminum framework was painted blue, easier to spot hydrogen leaks against the light colour. The ship had its own water recovery system, capturing moisture from diesel exhaust to partially replace dropped ballast. Sometimes the Hindenburg would brush through clouds deliberately, rainwater collecting in gutters that fed into ballast tanks. Every drop of water saved was weight that could be used for fuel or cargo or passengers. There was an elegance to these systems, a kind of mechanical poetry. Nothing was wasted. Everything had its purpose. The engineers who designed the Hindenburg understood that they were creating something that existed at the absolute edge of possibility. Every system had to work perfectly because there was no margin for error. And for 13 months, everything did work perfectly. Some moments aboard became the stories passengers told and retold for the rest of their lives. Flying over Manhattan, for instance. The Hindenburg often took routes directly over New York City, past the Empire State Building at an altitude low enough that passengers could see faces in office windows. Steamships below would bellow their whistles in greeting. Searchlights would train upward. The entire city would pause to watch the silver giant slide overhead. Imagine looking down on the spire of the Chrysler Building. Imagine having the skyline of New York spread below you in 1936, when the Empire State Building was barely 5 years old and still the tallest structure on Earth. The perspective, the sheer impossibility of the view, took your breath away. Or those moments when the ship would fly through the top of clouds, passengers watching from the promenade windows as wisps of vapour streamed past. Webb Miller described hours spent flying above a vast cloud sea so white that it was almost impossible to look at them in the blindingly brilliant sunlight. The ship's shadow moving across that white surface, surrounded by rainbow halos, the sense of being suspended between worlds, above the clouds, below the stars, in some liminal space that belonged to neither earth nor heaven. Or the dawn arrivals. Approaching the coast before sunrise, passengers crowding the windows in their nightclothes, watching that necklace of lights grow brighter. The pandemonium of ship whistles rising to greet them, that feeling of completing something remarkable, of having crossed an ocean by air, of stepping back onto solid ground with a story no one else would quite believe. These were the moments that made people fall in love with airship travel. Not the luxury exactly, though that helped, but the perspective. The intimacy with the world below, combined with the impossibility of being airborne at all. Through 1936, the Hindenburg compiled a record that seemed to prove the airship's commercial viability. 17 round-trip Atlantic crossings, 10 to the United States, 7 to Brazil. A total of 191,583 miles flown. 2,798 passengers carried, not a single injury. The fastest eastbound crossing clocked just 43 hours and 2 minutes. Even accounting for occasional headwinds, the average crossing time beat the fastest ocean liner by more than 2 days. And the experience, the comfort, the views, the sense of occasion was unlike anything available on water or land. The 1937 season opened with a round trip to Rio de Janeiro in late March. Everything seemed on track for an even more successful year. The sister ship, LZ-130, was under construction. Plans were being drawn for transatlantic routes to new destinations. The future of air travel seemed to belong to these silver giants. The first North American flight of 1937 departed Frankfurt on May 3rd, 36 passengers, 61 crew. Among the passengers was Bert Dolan, a perfume executive who had changed from an ocean liner just 2 days before departure. His colleague, Nelson Morris, had convinced him the faster crossing would get him home for Mother's Day. Before leaving, Dolan wrote to his wife, "None of us know the Lord's will." The crossing was delayed by headwinds, 12 hours behind schedule by the time they approached Lakehurst, New Jersey, on the evening of May 6th. In the galley, Chef Meyer had improvised meals, stretching provisions. About an hour before landing, he sent up a tray of sandwiches to the passenger lounge, the last food ever served aboard the Hindenburg. Passengers gathered at the windows, watching the mooring mast approach. Bert Dolan and Nelson Morris stood together at the starboard promenade. In the dining room, Matilda Döner kept close to her 3 children, Irene, 16, Walter, 10, and Werner, 8. Hamburg America line manager John Pans stood with his wife Emma. At 7:25 p.m. Eastern, as ground crew grabbed landing lines, fire erupted near the tail. Herbert Morrison's recording for WLS Radio Chicago captured what happened next. "It burst into flames! It burst into flames, and it's falling, it's crashing! Oh, the humanity and all the passengers screaming around here!" The window of opportunity to escape lasted roughly 13 to 16 seconds. In 32 seconds total, all 803 feet were consumed. Matilda Döner pushed her sons through a dining room window to safety, then jumped after them. Her daughter Irene left the dining room searching for her father. Both Irene and Hermann Döner died. John Pans was urged by photographer Carl Otto Clemens to jump, but Pans turned back to find his wife Emma, who had returned to their cabin for her coat. Both perished. Bert Dolan and Nelson Morris jumped from the starboard promenade. Morris survived. Dolan did not. Captain Max Pruss rowed the burning ship to the ground, ordered everyone out, then carried radio operator Willie Speck from the wreckage and re-entered looking for more survivors until rescuers physically restrained him. His face was devastated by burns. Captain Lehman escaped, but with severe burns covering much of his body. He told Commander Rosendahl the ship must have been destroyed by an infernal machine, sabotage. He died the following day. Heinrich Kubis survived by jumping from a dining room window. Chef Meyer survived by jumping from a service hatch, landing 15 feet below, virtually unscorched. Movie-tone newsreels filmed him smoking a cigarette as he walked away from the wreckage. 14-year-old cabin boy Werner Franz survived by soaking himself with water from a ruptured ballast tank before running through the flames. Of 97 people aboard, 36 passengers, 61 crew, 35 died, along with 1 member of the ground crew. 62 survived, many with terrible burns. Werner Döner, that 8-year-old boy pushed through the window by his mother, became the last living survivor of the Hindenburg disaster. He died on November 8, 2019, at age 90. Captain Pruss believed it was sabotage until his death in 1960. Hugo Eckener, the grand old man of German airship travel, believed a sharp landing turn snapped a bracing wire that punctured a gas cell, allowing hydrogen to leak into an electrically charged atmosphere following thunderstorms. The most widely accepted theory today points to electrostatic discharge igniting leaked hydrogen. but no definitive answer has ever been established. The mystery remains. What we know for certain is this. In 32 seconds, the age of passenger airships ended. Here's a truth that often gets lost. The Hindenburg's destruction didn't kill the airship. The airplane did. 3 months before the Hindenburg's first flight, Pan American's China Clipper had crossed the Pacific. By May 1939, Pan Am's Boeing 314 Clippers were crossing the Atlantic in half the time the Hindenburg could manage, at lower cost, without requiring enormous hangar facilities or hydrogen or ground crews of hundreds. The Zeppelin Company completed the sister ship, LZ-130, Graf Zeppelin II, in 1938, but the United States refused to export helium after Germany annexed Austria. The ship never carried a paying passenger. On Hermann Göring's orders, both Graf Zeppelins and the unfinished LZ-131 were scrapped in April 1940, their aluminum recycled for Luftwaffe aircraft. On May 6, 1940, exactly 3 years after the disaster, the Frankfurt airship hangars were dynamited. The rubble was cleared. The field became something else. The world moved on as it always does, but something ended at Lakehurst that went beyond one ship, one company, one technology. What vanished was an entire philosophy of travel. The idea that crossing an ocean should be unhurried, beautiful, conducted at an altitude where you could still see the world, where meals were served on gold-rimmed porcelain at tables dressed in linen, where windows could be opened to salt air, where takeoffs were so gentle you didn't realize you'd left the ground, where a pencil could balance on its end atop a table without falling. Roger Pilkington, who had flown aboard in 1936, captured it 2 decades later while flying in a Lockheed Constellation. I felt I had lost a friend, and I knew that airships were finished. The next generation would never see that enormous shape in the sky, hear the odd squeak of the echo sounder, see the shaft of light shining down from the nose. Chief Petty Officer Bull, Tobin's shouted order to his Navy landing party as they instinctively ran from the burning wreck. "Navy men, stand fast!" sent his sailors back into the flames to rescue survivors. It remains one of the most stirring acts of courage in American military law. Those sailors saved lives that day, but they couldn't save what the Hindenburg represented. In 62 successful crossings before that May evening, no Zeppelin passenger had ever been seriously injured. Not one. The safety record was perfect. More than 3,500 people experienced Hindenburg travel during its 13 months of operation. Fewer than 4,000 human beings in all of history ever flew aboard a passenger airship across an ocean. It was that rare, that brief, that precious, the dining room with its fresh flowers and murals of South American coastlines, the bar where Max Schulze mixed his cocktails that he could never quite get right, the promenade windows open to that narcotic ocean air 650 feet above the Atlantic, the absolute darkness of the interior cabins, the distant, constant hum of diesel engines, the drowsiness that overtook passengers by mid-morning, the gold-rimmed plates that defied every principle of weight saving because some luxuries were worth the cost. Captain Lehman inviting Clarence Hall to the control car and steering the ship directly over Hall's house in Philadelphia. Professor Wagner playing Schubert on that aluminum piano. The ship's shadow moving across clouds, surrounded by rainbow halos. The orchestra drifting up from first-class dining on the great ocean liners far below while you floated above, sipping champagne, watching stars appear in a sky that went on forever. All of it existed for 13 months. Then, in 32 seconds, it was gone. But here's what they couldn't destroy: the memory of what it felt like. Those who flew aboard, the ones who survived, who lived long lives, who became grandparents and great-grandparents, they never forgot. How could they? They had experienced something that would never exist again. They had crossed an ocean by air when that was still the rarest thing in the world. They had slept inside a ship filled with hydrogen and woken to sunrises over the Atlantic. They had balanced pencils on tabletops while travelling at 76 miles per hour, 650 feet above the sea. The stories they told their children and grandchildren carried a particular quality, part adventure, part elegy. Because they were describing something that couldn't be verified anymore, couldn't be revisited, couldn't be experienced by anyone who hadn't been there. "Let me tell you about the Hindenburg," they would say, settling into their chairs, eyes brightening with memory. "Let me tell you what it was like." And in those stories, the ship lived again. The dining room filled with light and conversation. The promenade windows opened to salt air. Chef Meyer sent perfect plates up the dumbwaiter. Captain Lehman played his accordion. The ship's shadow moved across clouds. Time stretched to 27 hours as they chased the sun westward. For a moment, for the length of the story, it was real again. Hugo Eckener called the disaster the hopeless end of a great dream, a kind of end of the world. And in a way he was right. That particular dream, that specific way of moving through the world, ended at Lakehurst. But dreams don't really die. They transform, they migrate, they find new forms. The dream of crossing oceans in comfort and style continued. It moved to different vessels, took different shapes. The Pan Am clippers, the great post-war prop liners. Eventually, for a brief moment, the Concorde, which was in its own way the Hindenburg's spiritual heir. Exclusive, technologically audacious, doomed by economics rather than tragedy, but doomed nonetheless. And through all those transformations, something essential persisted. The human desire to make travel more than mere transportation, to create not just a way to get from here to there, but an experience worth remembering, worth telling stories about, worth treasuring in memory for the rest of your life. The Hindenburg did that. For 13 months, for fewer than 4,000 passengers, it created experiences that became family legends. Moments that grandchildren heard about decades later, sitting at kitchen tables watching their grandfather's eyes light up as he said, "Let me tell you what it was like." So let's return one last time to that May afternoon in 1936. The Hotel Frankfurter Hof. The buses heading to Rhine-Main airfield, the hangar doors rolling open to reveal something so improbable it barely seemed real. 803 feet of possibility. A ship that would carry you across an ocean at 650 feet, low enough to see faces waving from shore, high enough to feel suspended between earth and sky. Walk with those passengers up the boarding stairs. Feel your heart pounding with that mixture of excitement and attempted calm. Step through the door in the hull and into the narrow corridors with their fabric walls. Find your tiny cabin, 35 square feet of aluminum and foam. Set down your precisely weighed luggage. Take a breath. Then walk to the promenade windows and look out at the world waiting below. Because in a few minutes, those engines will hum to life. The ship will lift so gently you won't quite believe it's happening. The ground will fall away, and Frankfurt will become a map drawn in 3 dimensions, and then Germany will become coastline, and then there will be only sea and sky and clouds and the impossible fact of your own flight. And for the next 2.5 days, you will live in a world that has never existed before and will never exist again. You will eat from gold-rimmed plates, sleep inside a ship filled with hydrogen, balance pencils on tabletops, open windows to salt air at 650 feet. Watch the ship's shadow move across clouds surrounded by rainbows. You will, for a brief and shining moment, fly aboard the Hindenburg. And 60, 70, 80 years later, you will still remember. You will still feel it. You will still try to find words adequate to describe what it was like. And your grandchildren listening will lean forward. They will try to imagine. They will almost be able to feel it themselves. That's the gift that May afternoon gave to the world. Not just the journey itself, but the memory of the journey. The story that could be told and retold, passed down, preserved. The Hindenburg is gone. But what it represented, the beauty, the audacity, the sheer human ambition of it that remains in the stories, in the memories, in the photographs and the menus and the gold-rimmed plates that survived and that people still treasure. In the quiet moment when someone leans forward and says, "Let me tell you what it was like." And in that telling, for just a moment, we're all aboard again. The windows are open. The salt air is fresh and cold. The ocean scrolls past 650 feet below. And somewhere in the distance, faint but unmistakable, you can hear the hum of engines carrying us towards something we'll remember for the rest of our lives.